In this video, I'm going to talk about radiator caps, and in particular this one here. It's used on a lot of different models. You've got the one at the back here, which is where the fill port is, and that's just designed to allow you to top it up if required, but that just acts as a plug. It doesn't do anything other than just plug the hole back here, whereas this one here is your pressure regulating valve, and it's a really important part of the cooling system, and these things do sometimes fail. And so what I'm going to do in this video is show you how to pull this thing apart and how to make some kit to test this, because there are two components of this. There's a pressure regulating valve to keep the pressure high when the engine is running, because as everything gets hot, then things will expand, and what it'll allow it to do is increase the pressure and then control it to a maximum amount, which for these is about 1.2 bar, about 19 psi. And anything above that allows it to expel the air, so you don't get a build up of pressure, things cracking and breaking, etc. But what it wants to do is allow that increase in pressure, because that's going to increase the boiling point of the coolant as well, which is really good. So you have more fat between the engine running temperature and where the coolant would actually boil off. The coolant in the system also increases the boiling temperature as well. So those two combined of the coolant being in there, vice water, and also the increase in pressure will drive the pressure up to probably about 120, 130 degrees for the boiling point, which is what you want. In addition to that, there is a second valve that allows air to go in when you shut the engine down and everything cools down. So everything's going to contract, and so you don't end up with a vacuum inside. It will allow air to go in very, very easily to equalize that. So what I'll do is I will show you the tools that I made, how to test all of this, how to pull this apart, how to clean it all out. Because you'll get dried coolant in here, especially if you've overfilled this a little bit, because obviously as the engine runs, it gets hotter. If there's too much coolant, it will push all the air out and then it will expel coolant. And the problem with that is that gets through all the workings of this. It will dry out over time, and I've had this before where in other cars where it's actually sealed up the mechanism and it won't release the pressure, and I've had to pull it apart and force the working parts apart from each other to make sure it worked again. So keeping this clean, and if you're in here, you've got the engine cover off and you're doing work on the system, it's actually pretty simple just to pull this thing apart and make sure everything's nice and clean and in good working order, and also to test it if you wanted to do that. So the way the cap works is that when you put it on the expansion tank, there's a seal at the bottom here. That's the thing that does the hard sealing, so it's the tightening down of the cap hard against the top of the expansion tank that does the sealing. And once the pressure builds up, what's going to happen is it's going to go through the mechanism, through the center here, and then it's going to be expelled out these gaps up the side here. It's important to note, like I said before, that the seal here does the sealing. Unlike, this is a BMW cap, and it has two O-rings on it that just go down a neck. So it's the O-rings that do the sealing. So this could actually be quite loose and it would still seal fine, whereas this you actually need to tighten it down quite hard, and having that seal in good condition to stop leaks is important. Pulling the cap apart is relatively simple. The bit that holds it all in is the rubber seal down the bottom here, and so as soon as you remove that, the whole thing just pulls straight out. And the way I found it easiest is to get a pick tool like this. I'm just going to put it under there like that, and then just sort of run it around like that. And it says that seal there. When you pull this out, note the orientation. There's a little slot in here on the side that comes up towards you. The other side there is flat. That seal can just come straight off. And because that lip there is not as wide as the seal, then that just goes in and out really easily. The seal sits down in a groove down in here. So later on when we put this back together again, all I'm going to do is slot that on, push this down, and then I just use a screwdriver just to feed this down and work it down underneath that lip, so it's all slotted in place. Opening this thing up is pretty simple. Get yourself a pair of flag tip pliers, and you're going to rotate this piece here round to the right, so it's righty-loosey. So we're going to put it in there like that and just turn. And then, because there's an O-ring here, it's just jammed in here, even though it's under spring pressure. It doesn't want to pop out straight away. You can either get a pair of long nose pliers and sort of gradually pull that out, or just get a little pick tool or something and then just lift it up and it'll come out. You just need to work that up because it's under that pressure of the O-ring. That'll come straight off. You can see that O-ring, it's actually there. It's sort of jammed in around there. Once you get the cap here loose, don't just pull everything off from there. I find it's easiest just to pull it over that way. And then you can just push this bit here out and everything should just fall out and stay in the correct position. And then you can pull things off one at a time. This thing here might actually be stuck in there like that. So if that does, pull that out and sort of just, just so you notice where that actually goes. But this is the way it's all put together. You've got the outside bit here, that's just one piece. You've got that little piece of mesh. That's your vacuum spring, so that's a really light spring. You've got the little thing around the outside there. That's got a seal around the outside, a silicon seal, and this seems to be formed all as one item. So that seal doesn't seem to come apart. All of these surfaces just need to be gently cleaned up with a cloth and some water, just to make sure they don't have any dried coolant on them or anything like that. Then you've got that piece there, and then you've got this one here. Again, you've got another piece of silicon sealant there. And then you've got the large spring. So that's the one that's really hard, and that's the one that is the control pressure regulating spring. So to put all this back together again, that'll just go back over the top of that. That can go on there like that. That goes over the top. That spring goes on. A little piece of mesh goes over the top. And then all you need to do is plonk that over the top. Give that a bit of a wiggle to make sure the mesh is in the right spot. And then we can just turn that over. And I find once you've turned it over with all the pieces in place, if you just sort of gently push down and rotate it, you'll find the slots where it's going to go down. Then I'm going to push it together. It'll go hard against that spring, but it'll jam in there with the O-ring, so it's not going to move. And then I can get my flag tip pliers, push it down, and then rotate it around, and everything's locked in place. You can go around the other side. You should be able to just gently push that vacuum spring down there quite happily, and now you can go ahead and test that before you install it again. The O-ring that's around this thing here, pretty easy just to get a pick tool in there and then just pull that out, clean that all up of all the dried coolant and that sort of stuff prior to installation again. And you'll know that you've got the seal all the way down there correctly when it'll just swivel there in the cap. The tool that I'm going to use to apply pressure to this, I've had to make up myself, because the thing that they would use to pressure test the caps in the dealership, they have a special fitting that goes onto this, and then you have a pan pump like a radiator pressure test kit would have, but it's a bespoke fitting that goes over the top of that. I don't have that, and unless you actually have the Porsche tool, I'm not sure you can actually get hold of that. So I've pulled that apart, and what I've done is I've just found an old radiator pipe that I was lying around my shed, and I've got one that's just the right size. It's about 35 mil across there, so that's just going to slot in there, hose clamp over that. It's just an old soda stream cordial bottle. It slots perfectly into that. Again, I'm going to put another hose clamp over that to seal that. And on this side here, I've just put a tiny little hole, and I'm going to either apply vacuum with my vacuum bleeder or pressure with just a battery operated compressor. And I'm going to apply pressure through a needle that you'd pump up a football or something like that with. So that's just going to go through there, and then it'll apply pressure. And the nice thing about the pressure on this thing here, I get a digital readout and it's live. I'll be able to pump it up to exactly the pressure that I want. I'll get some small leaks around the corners here. I'm not really too concerned about that. It's more watching this and seeing what's happening at the end here. In addition to that, with the brake bleeder, I can put that on there, and again apply vacuum to check that at next to no vacuum at all, it's sucking air in through that valve as well. And so to do my test, what I'm going to do is set everything up with everything sealed off, my needle in here, and I'm going to put this in a bucket of water when I apply pressure to it. That's just to check that I can see where the air is leaking from, to ensure that it's coming from the pressure relief valve here. Because the release pressure of the valve is supposed to be 1.3 bar, which is about 19 psi, I'm going to set this to 19 psi. and ensure that this starts to leak the air out of here by the time it gets to 19 psi. And then once it starts to leak, I can release it. This will give me a live pressure feed to check that it stops by the time it gets to 1 bar, which is about 14.5 psi. When you're initially making this setup, if this is what you're going to do, just be a little bit careful when you're first testing pressure with this. These need to be really well secured, otherwise these things will pop out like a gun. Had it open a couple of times where it had even like only low as 20 psi, because there's so much surface area here. When they come off, holy smoke, it's pretty special. So make sure you test those at a lower pressure first to check they're going to hold. Also, I found the sealing face on the cap itself, this bit here, there were some manufacturing marks and whatever there that made it a little bit difficult to get a good seal. So I just used some very gentle sandpaper. There were some lines here as well as sort of some timestamp things that are on there just to sand those off, so I actually got a better seal. And what I found is probably the easiest way to test the pressures quite accurately is to set this up to a little bit higher than that 1.3 bar. And then what I'm going to do is just tap this up so it just gently increases the pressure, maybe about a psi at a time, so I can see exactly when the thing opens. If you don't do it that way, I find that it just starts to blast out of here really easily, and it's a bit hard to work out exactly what the pressure is. Okay, so I can gently see it starting to come out there now. That's 17.5 psi. So I want it to be open at 1.3 bar, which is about 19 psi. So it's 16.5 there, it's not leaking from it. Just gently tap it up. Yeah, so it seems to be opening at about 18 psi and closing at 17 psi. So that's certainly within the boundaries of what I would think was acceptable. The second part of the test is to rapidly increase the pressure up to 1.8 bar to ensure that it opens. So I've set to 1.8 bar, which is about 26 psi, and this will pretty rapidly increase the pressure in a few seconds, like you would if you were using your hand pump and doing it as fast as you could. And we're just going to ensure that this opens before it gets to that 1.8 bar. Yeah, and easily does that, and I can see like it's sitting there at 20 psi, just leaking it out and just not allowing it to get any higher. So that seems to be working perfectly. For the vacuum part of the test, I'm just going to use my brake bleeder, and what I should see is when I apply vacuum via that needle valve, it should just suck air into this straight away. It's going to be a bit hard to know exactly where it's sucking the air in, so the first thing I want to do is just check that it doesn't actually allow the vacuum to increase. I can hear that. You're probably not going to be able to hear that, but I could hear that sucking in from there. But then what I found, to ensure that you are actually getting a vacuum and it's going through here and not sucking in somewhere else, put your hand or a piece of rubber or something like that and check that it sucks onto your hand like that, and you can see that's just holding onto my hand quite happily, and that's where it's holding the vacuum. So clearly when I'm doing it like this, it's going through that part of the valve there, so that's great.